morning, everyone. We are delighted to be here today at NDF, which is a non-partisan public policy organization based in Islamabad. Today we are hosting Mr. Andrew Small, who is a colleague as well as a friend and a global expert on China and regional security. Andrew Small is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the Marshall Fund of the United States. His research focuses on China relations, Europe-China relations, and broader developments in Chinese foreign policy and economic policy. He is an author of several books on China, and he has also just told us that he's finishing a new book on China, which probably will be out in publication very, very soon. Delighted to have you here, Andrew, we are grateful for your time here today to discuss various new developments in the region. My first question to you would be, Andrew, last 6 months there have been two major developments. One possibly more regionally defined, but also having global repercussions and global context, which is of course the change of taking over of Kabul by the Taliban, and the total withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And the second is, of course, what's happened in Europe in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Both these developments have seen a reinvigorated Chinese role, both within the region as well as at the global level. So given your background in China, given your continued work and investment in particularly looking at Chinese foreign policy, I would love to hear your views on both these developments. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, very glad to be here. Very glad to be at NDF, and very glad to be doing this with you, Simbal, of course. So these two are in kind of quite distinct issues, of course. So I'll start with Afghanistan. I think for China, Afghanistan was, of course, the issue they had seen coming and had been anxious about and preparing about in one way almost since the Obama surge/withdrawal speech, which already started to see them stepping up a little bit in a way where they had really sat on their hands before. But you saw the impetus after that point to take a somewhat more active political role, which they've retained in different ways since then. They did not actually, I think, by the end, they've tried to make the best out of the US withdrawal again as a sort of propaganda points and things like that, given how badly it seemed to be executed. But this was not something they actually wanted to see happen. They wanted to see a withdrawal under conditions that involved some kind of a political settlement. They were very nervous about, particularly just an outright Taliban military victory. They thought that this would be kind of emboldening, that you'd end up with a Taliban coming to power that was less willing to make compromises.
Pretty much the whole regional view, pretty much the view of almost all the regional countries as well. Yeah, especially which bordered Afghanistan.
And so I think this is them making the best now out of a situation that they've were really quite concerned about. And then they've tried to operate, of course, with some degree of a regional consensus and kind of slot in. They don't want to be too out front on any of these developments. But I think there's a lot of speculation internationally about some vastly expanded role that they'd play and ways that they'd swing in and things. And certainly all the exchanges I have on the Chinese side, notwithstanding, as I think we can go into some of what's been playing out in their role in the aftermath, they're very apprehensive about the even medium-term political situation. They will take their time and I think try and until there's a level of confidence about political stability and security conditions, I think they still tend to see it more as a sort of containment problem.
But as you said yourself, that they were reluctant to step in and they wanted a kind of a shift over once the US withdrew from Afghanistan in ways that the international community stayed connected with the next regime, which was Taliban participated but would include others. so that support, especially the economic support from the international community, would continue. That has not happened for one of these reasons, that it was a quick takeover by the Taliban. They drove into Kabul while they were, things hadn't really cleared up with the other political actors. And now the economic collapse of the Afghan economy. There were hopes, and there is constant discussion what kind of a role, supportive role, economic role China would play in Afghanistan, whether it is try to step in and fill that gap in. What do you think about that particular, because we haven't really seen much signs on that. There's talk of investment, but not really anything significant. How do you see this going forward?
No, I mean, exactly as you say, I think part of the reason for them wanting some kind of a political settlement was, it was twofold. One was, does this create a framework in the country that they think they can bet on over a longer term? And is there something that will stick? Or do you risk having a situation in which you get resistance and the thing unravels in whatever way? And then the second thing was, do you have a government that will at least jump through a few of the kind of legitimacy hurdles that are sufficient to mean that you'll continue to have resources coming in, that you'll get diplomatic recognition, that you won't have sanctions, because all of those things complicate China's involvement, of course. And so without that, it means it's just much trickier for them, because they're not an actor that swings in with large-scale development aid. They're doing some humanitarian assistance, but vastly smaller than things that are coming in from elsewhere. So the question has always been, what level of support can they provide through investments? But the investments in question are, in terms of the actual returns that would come, these are long-term projects. The ones that would make a difference to central government revenues, there are sort of smaller scale things that they could do, but not things that are really going to materially change the economic situation in the country. So you have, for the bigger investments, and INAC is the obvious one, since they already control it. These are things where I think the sense is...
and where they can possibly, it hasn't happened, but where they can possibly step in with some kind of investment, direct foreign investment, which will support the government without going through the whole recognition thing of...
So there are things they can do economic, and they can take a position that says, as they are, we don't believe in the sanctions, we need to create a stable economic picture here. What is it that they can do? In principle, this would be one of the things that they could do. But the Chinese companies have gone through difficult experiences with this. Most of the people working in financing bodies on the Chinese side are running quite scared of all of this. There will be political reasons to do this, but they may be political reasons to kind of engage in the negotiations. Certainly, that seems to be going on whether to move ahead with these things. Potentially funnel some loan money in, some upfront payments and things. You could envisage that happening. The harder thing is to envisage at the moment that they'd really kind of swing in with substantial commitments on the ground to say, we're convinced by this, we're ready to move ahead.
And become the key kind of an international benefactor of the Taliban.
There's a lot of...
They don't...
There's not enough of an imperative for them to do this quickly. I think they need to keep things spinning along. It needs to be perceived. I think they like the fact that they're seen by the Taliban as a potential source of revenue. That's helpful.
Very strongly. The Taliban are quite clear about it, and they've been very vocal about it, even internally in their speech acts inside, about China's role and what they expect and how, versus where, because obviously moving along with the U.S. fixing that relationship and with the European countries seems far more intractable for them. And so even internally they're talking about it, but one has to question as to what substantially can come out of that expectation in the medium to short term.
Well, that's then, and this is then this kind of, so how does that expectations management go? How far are you able to spin they spun out lots of discussions with the last government. INAC was spun out forever. Connectivity, infrastructure, BRI finance, lots of these conversations would go on for years without anything happening. And so this has a certain degree degree of immediacy to it, though. I mean, you can
they need that support,
they need the resources to come in from somewhere. So if it's not going to come in from China, but I mean, what I have expected is that they'll want to continue to position themselves in that way, that if the right conditions are met, there's a lot that they can do, which is also true. But how much they're willing to do quickly, and some of those conditions, including which include an area that you know well too, do relate to how they're seeing the security picture. TIP,
Al-Qaeda.
Yes, and so I mean, part of the concern in Afghanistan for them has been that there is the group that is, the one group that really does target them, but also they see themselves as potential targets for all sorts of different actors, and not just groups operating in the country, but
I mean, for them, they are potentially very, very clear and vocally being targeted by TTP.
Exactly.
And that also hinges on China's direct interest because of their CPEC investments in Pakistan. And TTP and ISKP groups, leaving the TIP and ETM aside, these people are the more active groups which are targeting Chinese interests, especially in Pakistan. We've seen several attacks. And we've heard that the number of Chinese workers have been reduced in certain areas, which slows obviously the projects for them, and it's difficult for them to monitor their investments and their projects. They have removed some of their workers from certain areas in Balochistan or from projects.
And this is already in Pakistan. So then the idea of them putting in a lot more commitments and exposing more risk, I think the inclination, I still believe, will be to sit this out for a while nonetheless they need to maintain this position which is a relatively benign one for them. It's helpful that the Taliban see them in these terms. It means they're helpful on different.
Also, I mean, for the Taliban also, even if it doesn't translate into hard cash or hard infusion of investment inside into helping their government, diplomatically having China speak in kind of support of Taliban legitimizes them in so many ways, and China has been playing that role pretty well in almost all forums, proactively meeting with the Taliban and all these spate of meetings in the region that they have done. I mean, Taliban delegation wasn't fully invited to participate in OIC here, and yet then Mutaki and flew to China for this meeting of the 6+ group that they have, the Chinese, the contact group. So it does legitimize them at this point, and they are in need of that. So.
And in the end, there will be a kind of alternative. If you don't get full diplomatic recognition, but there's a point in which people, a certain group of countries, accommodate themselves to whatever there is, China will be, of course, at the sort of in that nexus and will be kind of critical to the decision on how this goes. Because if you had a smaller subset of countries that said that it was time to move ahead, China will be key to that. And so I mean, you go back to these. It's the same conversations that were going on in 2000 in a different way, and China's a much more the resources China has available are much larger, it's more self-confident, more willing to take risks diplomatically, so there's more that they can get. But I mean, if you go back to those early conversations, it was about some protection from sanctions, it was about some economic commitments, it was ultimately, can you get towards diplomatic recognition, so and on the Chinese side, there was lots of conversations about ETIM, and so I mean, in one way, these are conversations that have been going on for the different variants for a long time. Yes, and some of these conversations were going on when they were in Pakistan and elsewhere as well. It was they're providing them with some resources, still concerned about the same sorts of groups. So I mean, these are long-running conversations that have been going on between the two sides. But there's a different level again of immediacy to these things because and they know, I mean, not everything's going to come through, but in the fullness of time there is a certain amount that China can do economically and can still be helpful even if they don't swing in with these really large scale investments. But that's still going to be a test. I mean, could could you again envisage a scenario in
walk
which
the talk, basically?
Yeah, I mean,
you can't stick to just the talk for too long.
You can't. This can't just be endlessly negotiated, because then otherwise there'll have to be a rebalancing of thinking on the Taliban side. So what do you kind of put in the mix at some point?
Yeah.